My parents stole my college fund to buy my brother a Porsche, so I gave my $825,000 bonus to the family who actually loved me. My parents stole the inheritance that was supposed to be mine so they could buy my brother a Porsche. When graduation day came around, I got the last laugh by handing my entire $825,000 signing bonus to my best friend's parents instead. My name is Nathan and I'm 24 years old. If you want to understand why I felt absolutely nothing the day I finally cut my family out of my life, you first have to understand the nonstop noise I'd been forced to live with since I was a kid. Growing up in my house meant learning how to disappear. I figured out pretty early that staying invisible was often easier than competing for attention I was never going to get. There was an unspoken family ranking and everyone knew exactly where they stood. My older brother, Derek, who's 29, was the unquestioned favorite. He was loud, demanding, impulsive, and unbelievably reckless. Yet somehow my parents treated him like he could do no wrong. Their entire world revolved around him. Every dinner felt like a performance, and Derek was always the star of the show. If I came home with straight A's, my parents would give me a quick nod, slap the report card on the refrigerator with some random magnet, and immediately change the subject to Derek's golf lessons or whatever expensive hobby had caught his attention that week. When Derek totaled his first car, a brand new Honda my parents had bought him with cash, my dad didn't punish him. He never asked him to pay for the damage or take responsibility for any of it. Instead, he gave him a reassuring pat on the back, said, "Accidents happen to everyone," and went right out and bought him another car. When I needed reliable transportation so I could get to my exhausting part-time job at the local hardware store, my dad handed me a printed city bus schedule. Then he smiled and told me that building character was what made a real man. My parents paid Derek's rent after he moved into a luxury high-rise apartment downtown. When he maxed out multiple credit cards buying designer watches and blowing money on weekend trips to Las Vegas, they paid those off too. Meanwhile, I was sitting at my kitchen table at 4 o'clock in the morning, filling out financial aid paperwork, desperately hoping I'd qualify for enough grant money just to afford my textbooks. I lived on an unbelievably tight budget, counting quarters before every trip to the laundromat and constantly worrying that missing even one overnight shift at the greasy 24-hour diner where I worked would throw my entire life into chaos. The moment that finally destroyed what little patience I had didn't happen all at once. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was standing inside my tiny, overheated college apartment. The air smelled like cheap instant noodles mixed with old textbooks and damp carpet. I'd just finished the last final exam of my senior year. 5 years of nonstop grinding had finally come to an end. 5 years of serving drunk customers at 4 in the morning, surviving on an embarrassingly small paycheck, and somehow keeping my GPA high enough to hold on to my academic scholarships. I was holding my phone while staring at the graduation cap I'd just taken out of its wrinkled plastic package. My mom answered when I called. I just wanted to go over the plans for graduation weekend. I asked what time they planned to drive up on Saturday, and warned her that parking on campus was going to be a complete disaster. I suggested they leave early enough to get there around 7:30 that morning. Instead of answering, there was a long, painful silence. I could hear ice clinking inside a glass. In the background, there were faint ocean waves and a daytime talk show playing on television. Then she finally spoke. She used that same light, carefree voice she always had whenever she was about to brush me aside like I didn't matter. She told me they weren't coming. They weren't. There wasn't even a hint of regret in her voice. No apology, no sadness. She delivered the news as casually as if she were reading tomorrow's weather forecast. She explained that they'd already booked a week-long vacation with Derek at an exclusive luxury resort in Bali. I stood there completely motionless. The cheap graduation gown slipped from my numb fingers and landed in a heap on the scratched linoleum floor. I asked her to repeat what she'd just said. Then I asked if this was supposed to be some kind of cruel joke. Instead of my mom answering, my dad took the phone. His voice was deep and authoritative, the same tone he always used while lecturing me about my decisions or trying to dominate neighborhood association meetings. He told me Derek had been under an incredible amount of pressure at his new corporate finance job. According to him, Derek desperately needed a vacation, and they'd managed to find an unbelievable deal on a luxury family suite. Then he actually had the nerve to tell me that college graduations were nothing more than long, boring ceremonies filled with pointless speeches. He said I was mature enough to attend by myself. I didn't yell. I didn't smash my phone into the cracked drywall. I just took a slow breath in that stale apartment and quietly asked if they truly understood they were choosing a vacation over the biggest accomplishment of my life. 5 years of blood, sweat, sacrifice, and sleepless nights. I asked whether they realized I was the first person in our immediate family to actually finish a college degree instead of dropping out. My mom jumped back into the conversation with the exact line she'd been using against me ever since I was little. "Nathan, sweetie, you're always so independent. You'll figure it out." Then she told me to take lots of pictures and post them in the family group chat so everyone could see how nice I looked in my graduation gown. After that, she casually mentioned she needed to finish packing her designer beach bag. Then she hung up. The dial tone echoed in my ear like the sound of a heart monitor going flat. I didn't cry. The betrayal ran far too deep for tears. Instead, an icy kind of clarity settled over me. For the first time, I accepted that I was completely alone in my own family. The painful truth was that I'd been alone all along. The worst part was realizing I'd spent years ignoring every obvious warning sign because I kept hoping things would eventually change. I honestly believed that was the lowest point. I couldn't have been more wrong. The moment that truly burned every remaining bridge happened the very next day. My cousin Ethan, who worked as a banking auditor, texted me and said we needed to meet for coffee as soon as possible. Ethan had always been nervous. He was the kind of guy who constantly looked over his shoulder, terrified that even the smallest family conflict would somehow pull him into the middle of it. We met at a crowded coffee shop near the financial district. We grabbed a sticky little table in the corner while the constant hiss of the espresso machines covered our conversation. He leaned forward until we were almost face to face, lowering his voice to a tense whisper. He looked genuinely sick. His face had lost its color and he couldn't stop fidgeting. The first thing he asked me was how I planned to pay the rest of my final tuition bill. I told him the truth. I'd emptied every dollar I had in savings and picked up as many double shifts at the diner as my manager would let me work. Ethan couldn't even look at me. He kept staring into his cardboard coffee cup before finally admitting he couldn't stay silent any longer. The guilt had been eating him alive and he said he couldn't carry it another day. Then he told me about the college fund. When my grandfather passed away, I was 15 years old. I still remembered sitting through the funeral and later listening to the attorney read the will in that stuffy little office. Back then, my parents told me Grandpa's inheritance had been used to pay off their mortgage and repair the damaged roof on the house. Every single word of that story was a lie. Not just a small lie either. A massive, calculated betrayal. According to Ethan, my grandfather's money had actually been divided into two separate college funds. One for Derek and one for me. That's exactly how Grandpa wanted it. Ethan looked me straight in the eyes before telling me what he'd discovered while reviewing financial records about a month earlier. My parents had emptied my entire college fund. Every last dollar was gone. They hadn't touched it because of a medical emergency. They hadn't used it to prepare for retirement or invest in a 401k. Instead, they cashed it out so they could buy Derek a brand new custom-ordered Porsche. Ethan explained that Derek had been whining nonstop because the people he worked with in corporate finance all drove expensive luxury sports cars. He felt embarrassed pulling into the parking lot in something ordinary, and apparently that bruised his ego. So my parents took the money my grandfather had specifically left for my education, money that was supposed to help build my future, and spent it on an overpriced sports car for my spoiled, entitled brother just to make him feel important. I could actually feel the blood drain from my face. The ringing in my ears became so overwhelming that the sounds of the busy coffee shop almost disappeared. At that point, it wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was theft. It was deliberate financial sabotage. They'd forced me to work until my hands were raw. They'd pushed me into debt. They'd watched me survive on instant noodles for 5 straight years while driving around knowing they'd bought Derek a Porsche with money that was supposed to belong to me. When I walked out of that coffee shop, I wasn't the same person who had walked in. The version of Nathan that still wanted his parents' approval died right there on that rain-soaked sidewalk. I was finished trying to be the quiet, obedient son who kept swallowing his pride just to maintain their version of peace. They always bragged about how independent I was. Fine. I decided I was finally going to show them exactly what real independence looked like. I drove straight to my best friend Julian's house. I didn't even bother knocking. After spending so much of high school hiding out there to escape my own home, walking through the front door without knocking had practically become part of the family routine. The moment I stepped inside, I collapsed onto their comfortable living room couch. Julian's dad, Walter, was sitting in his favorite armchair reading a thick, hardcover novel, his reading glasses resting near the end of his nose. His mom, Diane, was in the kitchen baking something that filled the whole house with warmth. Julian came downstairs, took one look at my face, and froze before he even reached the last step. That was it. I couldn't keep everything bottled up anymore. Everything I'd been holding inside finally came pouring out. I told them everything. I told them about my parents skipping my graduation. I told them about their luxury vacation to Bali with Derek. I told them about the lies surrounding my grandfather's inheritance. I told them they had stolen my college fund. And I told them about the Porsche. As I talked, my entire body shook. I'd clasped my hands together so tightly that my knuckles had turned completely white. I expected sympathy. I expected the uncomfortable silence people usually fall into after hearing something that heartbreaking. Instead, Walter quietly closed his book, laid it on the coffee table, and removed his glasses. The expression on his face wasn't pity. It was pure protective anger. Not anger directed at me, anger for me. A moment later, Diane walked in from the kitchen, drying her flour-covered hands on a dish towel. She sat beside me on the couch and wrapped both arms firmly around my shoulders while I tried to hold myself together. She didn't offer meaningless cliches. She never told me that family comes first or that time heals everything. Instead, she looked me straight in the eyes with a kind of fierce motherly love I'd never experienced from my own parents. Then she quietly said, "Nathan, those people don't deserve to sit in those seats. They don't deserve to watch an incredible young man walk across that stage. But if you'll let us, we'd be honored to be there instead." I looked over at Walter. He gave me one firm nod, his jaw set with determination. Then he told me his best charcoal suit was already pressed and hanging in the closet. That was the exact moment my entire understanding of family changed forever. Family wasn't defined by blood. Blood alone meant absolutely nothing. Family was made up of the people who stood beside you when you had nothing they could gain. Family was the people who defended you even when you weren't there to hear it. As painful as my personal life had become, it wasn't the only battle I was fighting. For the previous 2 years, I'd been working as an intern at a major film production company while secretly spending every spare minute writing my first feature-length screenplay. That script was more than a passion project. It was my escape plan. It was my chance to leave poverty behind for good. I poured every ounce of loneliness, heartbreak, frustration, and ambition I had into every single page. There was another employee in my department named Trevor. Trevor looked polished on the outside, always wearing expensive designer suits, but underneath, he was nothing more than a snake. His wealthy parents had practically bought him a place in the industry, yet he didn't have an ounce of real creative talent. He survived almost entirely through family connections and had developed a reputation for stealing ideas from younger interns whenever he saw an opportunity. For weeks, he'd been lingering around my desk, asking suspiciously detailed questions about the screenplay I was writing. 3 days before graduation, I got to the office earlier than usual. As I walked into the busy workspace, I spotted my manager, Gerald, a veteran producer who had absolutely no patience for corporate nonsense, standing beside the main printer. Trevor was right there next to him. In his hands was a thick stack of freshly printed pages. My screenplay. He was confidently pitching it to Gerald as if he'd written every word himself. Without even flinching, he claimed he'd spent the entire weekend polishing the dialogue in the third act. A cold, controlled anger settled over me. After everything my parents had just stolen from me, I wasn't about to stand there and let another entitled parasite take something else that belonged to me. I walked straight over to them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I simply looked Trevor directly in the eyes and calmly asked him to explain the character arcs in the third act. I looked Trevor straight in the eye and calmly asked him to explain the emotional transformation that took place in scene 37. He immediately froze. For a second, he just stood there blinking before trying to recover with a stream of empty industry jargon and buzzwords that didn't actually answer the question. Sweat had already started forming around the collar of his expensive dress shirt. Then he looked at Gerald, silently hoping he'd step in and save him. Instead, I turned to Gerald myself. "Open it to page 52, I said. "Now read the first letter of every line in the main character's monologue." Gerald raised an eyebrow but did exactly what I asked. He flipped through the pages, scanned the dialogue, and suddenly stopped reading. His expression changed instantly. Months earlier, while finishing the screenplay, I'd hidden something almost nobody would ever think to look for. The first letter of every line formed an acrostic. Letter by letter, it spelled out, "Written by Nathan." It wasn't an accident. I'd intentionally built my signature into the script itself, a watermark that couldn't be erased or copied. Trevor's face lost every bit of color. He started stumbling over his words, insisting there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Then came the threats. He claimed his father had powerful attorneys. He swore they'd sue the company. He even started talking about defamation. Gerald didn't react, not even a little. He looked Trevor up and down like he was staring at something he'd stepped in. Without saying another word, he grabbed him by the arm and escorted him straight to human resources. Patricia, the HR director, wasted absolutely no time. 15 minutes later, Trevor was cleaning out his desk into a cardboard box while a security guard stood nearby, making sure he didn't leave with anything that wasn't his. His career at the company ended right there. He was fired immediately for stealing someone else's intellectual property. That afternoon, Gerald asked me to stop by his office. He sat quietly behind his oversized glass desk, tapping a silver pen against the surface before finally looking up. "This script isn't just good," he said. "It's exceptional." Then he told me something I never saw coming. Several weeks earlier, he'd secretly forwarded my screenplay directly to executives at the parent studio instead of waiting for the normal approval process. They'd already read it. They'd already made their decision. According to Gerald, my life was about to change forever. The next morning, I found myself sitting in an executive boardroom on the top floor of the studio headquarters. The leather chair was more comfortable than any piece of furniture I'd ever owned. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire skyline, but I barely noticed the view. All of my attention was focused on the woman sitting across from me. Her name was Sophia. She served as both CEO and head of production, and she carried herself with effortless authority. She skipped the introductions. She skipped the small talk. Instead, she slid a thick contract across the polished conference table. I looked down at the number on the first page. For a moment, everything around me seemed to disappear. The amount was almost impossible to process. It was enough money to buy a home outright, enough to erase every financial fear I'd lived with for years, enough to make sure I never had to wonder how I'd pay rent, tuition, or groceries ever again. More than anything else, it represented freedom. The contract officially hired me as the studio's lead screenwriter. I signed every page without my hand shaking once. Sophia smiled. It wasn't a polite smile. It was the expression of someone who knew she'd just made an excellent investment. Then she leaned forward. "There's something else," she said. She explained that the studio happened to be one of the university's largest corporate sponsors. As part of that partnership, she'd already been invited to deliver the keynote speech during graduation. She wanted to announce my screenplay acquisition live during the ceremony, in front of the graduating class, in front of the faculty, in front of donors, alumni, reporters, and everyone watching the broadcast. Then she reached into a folder and handed me a gold-embossed VIP pass. "This is for your guests," she said. After that, she handed me a small card. "Write down the names of the parents who stood beside you through all of this. I'd like to recognize them personally during my speech." I stared at the blank space. My mind immediately drifted back to everything that had happened. The Porsche, the messages from Bali, the college fund my grandfather had left me, the years of struggling while my parents financed Derek's lifestyle. Without hesitating any longer, I picked up the pen. I carefully wrote 2 names: Walter, Diane, no one else. Update 1. By the time Saturday morning arrived, I felt strangely calm. The air outside was cool, the sky was perfectly clear, and the whole campus buzzed with excitement. I slipped my graduation gown over my shoulders and stood in front of the cheap mirror hanging on my closet door. For several seconds, I simply stared at myself. The person looking back wasn't the exhausted college student who survived on overnight diner shifts. He wasn't the forgotten younger brother who spent his life chasing approval. For the first time, I saw someone who had earned everything on his own, someone who refused to quit. The drive to campus was quiet. When I got there, families were everywhere. Parents hugged their kids. People carried flowers. Everyone laughed, smiled, and took pictures together. Everywhere I looked, I saw the kind of support I'd wished for my entire life. Oddly enough, I didn't feel bitter anymore. I felt ready. Inside the auditorium, thousands of graduates filled their seats while the orchestra tuned their instruments, and conversations echoed through the massive room. I looked toward the reserved VIP section. Walter was impossible to miss. He wore his charcoal suit like he was attending the inauguration of a president, sitting proudly with perfect posture. Next to him sat Diane in a beautiful floral dress. She already had a tissue in her hand before the ceremony had even started. When our eyes met, she smiled so wide it nearly broke my heart. She waved excitedly. Walter simply placed his hand over his heart and gave me a firm nod. That one small gesture meant more to me than anything my own parents had ever done. They weren't related to me. There wasn't a single drop of shared blood between us. But blood had stopped meaning anything to me. As the lights dimmed and the graduation procession began walking into the auditorium, I finally understood what family actually meant. It wasn't biology. It was love. It was loyalty. It was showing up. Meanwhile, my parents were thousands of miles away at a luxury resort in Bali. I could almost picture them relaxing beside the pool with expensive drinks in their hands, laughing without a care in the world. They believed they'd won. They thought I'd quietly accept everything they'd done, collect my diploma, and disappear from their lives without making a sound. They couldn't have been more wrong. They had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. They were finally about to learn that silence can be louder than any argument. The university president stepped up to the podium and launched into the usual commencement speech. He talked about opportunity. He talked about the future. He talked about the importance of perseverance and hard work. I barely heard a word. My focus was somewhere else entirely. My heartbeat stayed slow, steady, and calm, pounding with quiet confidence against my chest. After what felt like an endless 40 minutes of speeches and academic traditions, the moment I'd been waiting for finally arrived. The dean stepped to the microphone and called my name. Nathan! I walked out from behind the curtain and into the bright white stage lights. The heat from the overhead spotlights hit my face instantly. I crossed the stage at an even pace, my footsteps disappearing into the thick, crimson carpet beneath me. When I reached the dean, we shook hands. The dean. He handed me the empty leather diploma cover, and I paused long enough for the university photographer to snap the official picture. To anyone watching, it was completely ordinary. 6 quiet seconds. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable. Exactly the kind of moment my parents expected me to have. Then I walked back down the stairs, returned to my seat, and disappeared into the crowd like everyone else. I imagined my mom taking a quick screenshot of the live stream on her iPad just so she could say she'd watched. She'd probably send a half-hearted congratulations before turning all of her attention back to Derek. But graduation wasn't over yet. The dean returned to the microphone and lightly tapped it twice. The entire auditorium gradually fell silent. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice filling the room through the massive speakers. Before we conclude today's ceremony, we have a very special announcement. He paused. It is our honor to welcome the CEO and head of production from one of the world's largest film studios. Please welcome Sophia. A wave of confused whispers rolled through the audience. The velvet curtains slowly opened. Sophia stepped onto the stage wearing a perfectly tailored white suit that radiated confidence and authority. In one hand, she carried a sleek black leather portfolio. Within seconds, every whisper disappeared. She adjusted the microphone and looked across the audience. Good morning, she began. I'm not here to tell you to follow your dreams. The film industry doesn't reward dreams. It rewards execution. It rewards discipline. And above all, it rewards the rare people willing to keep working long after everyone else has stopped believing in them. A chill ran down my spine. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. A few weeks ago, Sophia continued as she slowly walked across the stage, our studio acquired a feature-length screenplay. It was bold. It was brutally honest. And it impressed every executive who read it. She paused again. It wasn't written by an established writer. It was written by an intern who worked overnight shifts at a diner just to pay rent while finishing college. The room became so quiet you could almost hear people breathing. That intern is graduating here today, she smiled. And as of yesterday morning, he is no longer an intern. Our studio has promoted him to lead staff writer. His starting salary is the highest we've ever offered to someone entering this position. We didn't simply purchase a screenplay. We invested in a remarkable career. She closed the distance back to the podium and opened the portfolio. Nathan, her voice echoed through the auditorium. Please stand. My chest tightened as I slowly rose to my feet. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Instantly, thousands of people turned to look at me. Television cameras swung in my direction, and within seconds, my face appeared on the enormous screens hanging beside the stage. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I simply looked back at Sophia. She nodded before speaking again. Behind every successful person is someone who believed in them. Our studio believes those people deserve recognition as well. She turned toward the front row where the VIP guests were seated. When I asked Nathan who had supported him through the hardest years of his life, he gave me only 2 names. The people who prove that family is defined by love and commitment, not by DNA. She reached inside the portfolio one final time. Then she unfolded an oversized ceremonial check. The entire audience leaned forward. To Walter and Diane, she announced, her voice carrying clearly throughout the auditorium. On behalf of our studio, and as part of Nathan's signing agreement, we're honored to present you with a gratitude award totaling $825,000. For one brief second, the room was completely silent. Then everything exploded. Gasps echoed from every direction. People jumped to their feet. Some screamed. Others simply stared in disbelief. The applause that followed was almost overwhelming, crashing through the auditorium like a tidal wave. I looked toward the front row. Walter looked completely stunned. His mouth hung slightly open, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw him speechless. Beside him, Diane covered her mouth with both hands while tears streamed down her cheeks, washing away her makeup. Sophia smiled and motioned for them to join her on stage. Still holding hands, they slowly climbed the stairs together. They looked overwhelmed, almost unable to believe any of it was real. Sophia handed the ceremonial check to Walter. He looked down at the number. Then he looked across the stage at me. Ignoring every camera pointed in his direction, he quietly mouthed 4 simple words, "Thank you, son." Nothing about that moment was ever going to leave me. Those words meant more than the money ever could. At the same time, I couldn't help imagining what was happening thousands of miles away in Bali. I pictured my parents sitting beside the resort pool with an iPad playing the graduation livestream. I imagined my mother's mimosa slipping from her hand as the color drained from her face. I pictured my father choking on his drink while desperately grabbing the volume controls, convinced he'd heard the announcement wrong. The same amount of money they'd valued more than their own son, the very money they'd stolen to buy Derek his Porsche, had just been handed to two people who weren't related to me at all, and it had happened live in front of the entire world. By the time the ceremony ended and we finally managed to fight our way through the crowd, all three of us were emotionally exhausted. We climbed into Walter's car and drove to an upscale private steakhouse to celebrate. For the first time in years, I actually felt at peace. Then my phone started vibrating across the polished wooden table. Buzz, 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 it didn't stop. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. The notifications came in so fast that I couldn't even read one before three more appeared. By the time I finally looked at the screen, I had 92 missed calls. The text messages were even worse. My mom demanded to know who Walter and Diane were and what had happened on stage. My dad ordered me to answer my phone immediately, accusing me of humiliating the family in front of the entire country. Derek couldn't believe I had given $825,000 to complete strangers instead of my own family. Then another message from my father came through. He said he was calling his lawyer because I had no right to give away that money. According to him, it belonged to the family, and after everything they'd spent raising me, they deserved it. I couldn't help laughing. My own father was threatening legal action because I had given my signing bonus to the people who had actually been there for me. The entitlement was unbelievable. Diane glanced down at my phone as it buzzed across the table again. "You don't have to answer them," she said softly. She was right. I flipped the phone face down, picked up my menu, and enjoyed dinner with the people who had actually earned a place at my table. Later that night, after I got home, I opened the family group chat one final time. I typed one short message. "You always told me I was independent. You said I'd figure things out on my own. Well, I did. Enjoy the rest of your trip to Bali. Don't ever contact me again." I hit send. Then I blocked every one of their numbers. Just like that, they were gone from my life. The next 8 months were the quietest and happiest months I'd ever known. I never reached out to them, and they had no way of reaching. While they disappeared from my world, my career exploded. The studio officially moved my screenplay into pre-production, and before long, I bought a beautiful modern home in a gated community. I also created a trust fund for Julian's future children because I wanted to make sure the people who had stood by me would always know how much they meant to me. Ironically, I was living the exact life my parents had always wanted for Derek. The only difference was that I'd earned every bit of it myself. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, my office security desk called. "There's a woman downstairs insisting she has to see you," the guard said. "She's crying and claims it's a family emergency." I told him to let her come up, but to keep a security officer nearby. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and Aunt Linda walked into my office. She looked exhausted. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled, and even her strong perfume couldn't hide how worn out she looked. The moment she sat down, she burst into tears. "Nathan," she cried, "you have to help them. They're losing everything." I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. I didn't offer her a tissue. I simply said, "Explain." The truth came pouring out. Everything my parents had told me about Derek's stressful finance job had been another lie. He hadn't been overwhelmed by work. He'd been stealing from the company. For years, he'd been running a fraudulent expense scheme, quietly embezzling millions of dollars to support his expensive lifestyle. 3 months after my graduation, company auditors uncovered everything. He was fired immediately. The police escorted him out of the building. The company sued him for millions, and federal investigators froze his assets. His wife filed for divorce, sought full custody of their child, and demanded alimony. Within days, Derek had lost almost everything. Just like he'd done his entire life, he ran back to my parents. Trying to save him, they refinanced their house to the limit and emptied every retirement account they had to pay for expensive lawyers. It wasn't enough. He lost. The court ordered him to pay massive restitution. The Porsche was repossessed. Then the bank started foreclosure proceedings on my parents' house. Because the housing market had dropped, they owed more than the house was worth. Linda lowered her head. "They're meeting with a bankruptcy attorney tomorrow," she whispered. "The inheritance, their savings, the house, it's all gone." Then she looked at me with desperate eyes. "They just need a loan. Not all of it. Just a small part of what you gave Walter and Diane. They're your family, Nathan. You owe them." I picked up the pen on my desk and tapped it lightly against the glass. Then I looked her in the eye. "I owe them exactly what they gave me. I paused. Nothing. Then I pressed the intercom and asked security to escort her out. 3 days later, I was leaving work when I saw someone waiting near the entrance to the underground parking garage. It was my father. Rain had soaked the pavement, and he stood there wearing a thin jacket that did little to keep him warm. He looked years older than the last time I'd seen him. The confidence that used to define him had completely disappeared. When he spotted me, he stepped into my path. "Nathan," he said, "we need to talk. You ignored your aunt. Your family is falling apart and you're turning your back on us." I said nothing. "We gave you a home," he continued. "We fed you. We raised you." I finally answered. "You did the bare minimum required to raise a child. Congratulations. Would you like a medal for that?" He flinched. "Derek made mistakes," he said quietly. "He's still your brother. We're about to lose our home. You have more money than you'll ever need. You can't just leave us like this." I looked him straight in the eye. "Watch me." His expression hardened. "If you walk away," he snapped, "I'll go to the press. I'll tell everyone what kind of son you really are." "My lawyer?" I laughed before he could finish. "Your lawyer? The one you can't afford because you spent your retirement defending a convicted criminal?" I shook my head. "Go ahead. Tell the media how you stole my college fund to buy Derek a Porsche. Tell them how you skipped my graduation so you could vacation in Bali. My public relations team would love that story." He opened his mouth but couldn't find a single word. For the first time, he understood he couldn't control me anymore. I took one step closer. "My attorneys already have a restraining order ready. If you, Mom, or Derek ever come near my home, my office, or the people I call family again, I'll make sure you spend years dealing with lawyers. Do you understand?" He didn't answer. He simply stared at the wet pavement. I walked past him, got into my car, and drove away. That was the last time I ever saw him. A few months later, Thanksgiving arrived. My house was full of laughter. The kitchen was covered with homemade food. Julian was telling another one of his stories while pouring wine into everyone's glass. Walter carved the turkey. Diane tasted the gravy and smiled. For the first time in my life, dinner was peaceful. No tension, no manipulation, no one competing for attention, just people who genuinely cared about each other. When we finally sat down, Walter lifted his glass. "To family," he said, "the family we choose, and the family that chooses us." We all raised our glasses. As they clinked together, I realized something I'd spent my entire life trying to understand. The family I was born into had buried me under years of neglect and betrayal, but they hadn't buried my future. I climbed out on my own, and on the other side, I found the family I'd been searching for all along.